Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do in order to walk through this data set is I'm just going to attach the raw data. Remember, attach allows me to refer to variable names in the data set without having to describe where they're coming from every time. Um, this is not always a good idea. In this example, I'm doing it because I think it allows some of the subsequent code to be easier to understand uh, for beginners, but I don't necessarily like want to convey to you that you always have to be working with an attached data set. Um, but it's fine to do so. And in this case, I'm going to follow this series of steps that kind of adds an extra step into creating the data set that I'm going to be working with for the actual statistical analysis. What I'm going to do is create new variables in the global environment temporarily, and then I'm going to package them all up in a new data frame for analysis. But of course, you definitely don't need to do that. In many cases, it would be more sensible to skip the intermediate step and create new variables directly in either a new data frame that you're planning to work with or adding them into the existing raw data frame. But all of the options are pretty much equally good in this case because it's a fairly simple example. Um, so the first thing that I'm going to do, if this was a real data set and I was not already familiar with it, I would probably want to uh, do things like this to look at uh, the the contents of the data set, get a feeling for what kinds of variables are present. I might even open it in Excel ahead of time. Excel can be quite a handy tool for exploring rectangular data sets in an informal way before you start doing more formal statistical analysis. I don't suggest generally editing data in Excel or saving over data files that have been created in Excel because it does weird things like mess with dates that can be hard to control, but it can be really handy for looking at stuff. Anyway, I'm already familiar with this data set. I'm just going to start working with some of the variables, and one of those is called condition. So here's a tabulation of condition. I'm using the table function here with use NA equals always, and I can see that there's no missing values. 134 participants were in the illegal condition and 133 in the legal condition, and then 5 have a empty string for this variable, which I do eventually want to treat as a missing value. But the way that this got spit out of Qualtrics, R didn't recognize that those were missing values initially, which is perfectly fine. To illustrate the tab NA function, I can just call that function with the single argument condition, and it gives me exactly the same result because it's designed to do exactly this, run the table function with whatever arguments are supplied, except this alternate default use NA equals always. And then I'm going to make a new variable cond that does two things to condition. The first is that it's going to recode condition so that the empty string becomes NA. Remember, recode is a function in the car package. The first argument is the variable you want to recode. And then there's a long string containing uh, an old value, an equal sign, and then a new value. And then you would separate them with semicolons if you had more than one. In this case, I just have the one, so the empty string becomes NA. And that entire instruction is contained within single quotes because I chose to use double quotes to represent the empty string in there. Having converted empty strings to NA, I'm plugging the output of the recode function into the factor function, which will just convert it to a factor. So after I run that, cond will be a factor. We can tell that. That's a that cond is a factor, and it's represented as a vector of integers. That's what a factor is behind the scenes in R. Instead of storing it as strings, it stores them as integers, but it keeps track of the strings that label those integers, and it also keeps track of the mere fact that those are distinct categories rather than quantities of something for statistical analysis. Um, Then I'm going to make a couple of handy binary representations with ones and zeros of the same variable just for my own convenience later. This is not necessary. Sometimes I like to do it. And all I'm doing is converting this factor to a number as numeric converts something to a true numeric variable. And what I'm converting is the vector of trues and falses generated by testing whether cond is equal to the string legal. Cond is a factor, that's okay. It will return true. This logical expression will return true if for cases where the value of condition has the label legal, even though legal is technically a string here and the values of condition are integers with string labels, then those trues and falses are going to get converted to ones and zeros with as dot numeric. So legal looks like this. Makes sense. 133 cases are legal, just like up here. 134 discrimination was illegal, and there's 5 missing values. Illegal will do just the opposite. Um, and again, this is totally unnecessary. I just find it sometimes convenient to have um, the um, opposite representations of exactly the same thing. Um, I might also be interested in information about participants paying attention. And so in this survey, participants were asked to indicate that they read the vignette with a checkbox. They were all supposed to read it, of course, but here I'm noticing that 263 of the participants checked the box, and 3 of them left it empty. -99 is how Qualtrics represented questions that the participants saw but did not respond to, because I chose to export the data that way. So I'm going to make a new variable called read law, like the indication of whether they admitted, whether they claimed that they read the law or not, um, by recoding this existing variable such that the -99 becomes 0, because 0 is a good way of representing no to me. And so now I have this new variable that has some scattered missing values and the 3 zeros that I knew about people who did not check the box. I don't know if I'm going to use that information or not yet, but it's nice to know.